Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. Welcome to my first Netflix comedy special. We'll be talking tonight about the Speedball story, and it's quite an interesting story. I'll tell you a little bit about it. But first, let's start with a little bit of atmosphere. This is Lake Washington. You guys are well familiar with Lake Washington. Lake Washington's a ribbon lake. It's long and narrow, and it's the kind of lake that takes its shape from being excavated by a glacier. Lake Washington is estimated to have been formed some 17,000 years ago. On February 19th, 1959, a man died quietly in this house that he had built on the shores of Lake Washington. And that same day, a Thursday, in schools of the Pacific Northwest and across America, art and design students opened a small 6x9 paper-bound booklet of 96 pages filled with a wide variety of lettering examples. They reached for their pens, they dipped them in ink, and they began to practice pen lettering that they hoped could later be applied to a variety of commercial applications, from signs and show cards to layout and design for advertising and to lettering and drawing for comics. The book was the 17th edition of the Speedball textbook, and the pens were Speedball pens. Both were the legacy of the man who had built that lake house, Ross F. George. I was fortunate enough to be asked to be the co-editor of the 100th anniversary edition of the Speedball textbook. This is Angie Vangelis's cover design that I still will be one of my all-time favorites. And during the design of that book, both Angie and Kelly from Speedball, who was the project manager, decided to do fold-out pages. And the fold-out pages they came up with contained all of the Speedball textbooks throughout history. And it intrigued me. I found that I really wanted to know more about the history of this book, and I wanted to know more about the man who had invented the pen that started it all. Now, if you ever want to know anything, or if I ever want to know anything, one of the first calls I make is to Carl Roars. Carl said, "Oh, my friend Lee just bought an original Ross George piece, and this is the piece that Lee had bought. He had gone to an antique shop owner and purchased this piece. Now, this is a pretty large piece, and when I called him and talked to him and said, listen, we're doing the Speedball textbook. It's the 100th anniversary edition. I'd like to know more. Do you have any contact information?" He gave me the contact information to the antique shop owner. And I basically emailed the owner and said, yeah, I don't want to bug anybody, but if you can connect me up with the granddaughter who found all these archives, I would really be grateful, because this is what we're doing. Well, a couple of days later, I got a call from that granddaughter, Sue George Urkowski, and she said, "Hi, this is Sue George." And I'm like, yeah? And she, Ross George's granddaughter. And I was like, oh, hi. And so we talked, and she had actually found the archives about 3 years earlier, but she didn't really know what to do with them. They'd actually built a room inside the barn to keep everything pristine. And so during that phone call, I said, well, would you consider having somebody come over and scan these pieces and archive them? She said, sure. And I said, okay, well, would you consider having me come over and scan these pieces and archive them? And she said, sure. And I said, okay, I'll call you back tomorrow. And I immediately hung up the phone, and I called Walt Glazier, who's the owner of Speedball. And I said, we just found the archives, and this is what we want to do. And so within about a week, I got to experience this. Can you imagine? We've gone through these Speedball textbooks. Catherine herself had been looking to try and find some of these original pieces, and here they were, all in pristine condition. Sue's aunt had died, and her aunt was a musician, and her aunt lived in Ross George's house. And down in the basement, she had piled up all kinds of papers, and she was a singer in the choir, and she had stacks and stacks of music, all of it stacked on top of these boards, keeping them pristine. Suze kind of woke up one morning and said, I think I know where those pens are. And it took her a couple of days literally to tunnel through all of this stuff and she found those pens. And as well as finding those pens, which some of which were handmade, you could tell that they were made on the shop bench. You weren't even sure if they could make a whole stroke. But she also found pictures, and she found documents, and she found notes and articles on how this pen was invented. And so at a certain point, after I had been there for 3 days and we'd scanned everything and uploaded everything, in a conversation, I made a promise to Sue that, and to myself, that if it was possible, I'd write the history of Ross George in the Speedball textbook. Shortly after the Speedball textbook, the 100th anniversary edition was finished, I made a trip to the 40th anniversary of the Letterheads meeting at the American Sign Company in Cincinnati, Ohio. The guy in the green shirt there is Mark Otis. Some of you know. Mark Otis was one of the original letterheads who formed a group of sign painters that would be able to share secrets with each other so that they could all help each other out. You'll see why that's important later. The letterheads all get together and they do these giant murals, stuff that probably wouldn't fit on our drawing table. You'll see the guy in the front there and he's painting a pretty large mural, and then you'll see some little guy over his shoulder in the back. That's me painting on this giant wall a baseball player from, I think, 1897, the Boston Red Stockings. This is the mural when it was big. Like I say, most of us haven't really lettered quite that big. These guys are professionals. And this was a great week because I also got to take a second class from a friend and colleague, Carl Rohrs, who had originally kind of got me into this whole thing. Well, during that time at the American Sign Museum, they were doing some renovations. And in the back room, they had kind of everything torn apart, and they had a bunch of stacks of stuff against one wall. Well, those stacks of stuff were Signs of the Times magazines. Signs of the Times began in 1906. And in these stacks, they were stacked by year, and they had all the way back to the original Signs of the Times initial issue from 1906. Now, this is important because if I'm going to do any kind of research, these guys were show card writers, Signs of the Time featured show card writers, and this is where I would find any of the information that perhaps we couldn't find in any of our other research. Through phone calls and further research, one of the owners of the brother of the owner at the American Sign Museum happened to work at Signs of the Times. One of the reasons he happened to work there was because his grandfather had started Signs of the Times. And so I gave him a call and I said, hey, do you guys have any way to figure out if you have any articles by the two guys that invented the pen? One of them was Ross George and one of them was William Gordon. And he said, well, actually, yeah, I made a catalog of all the titles in the table of contents, and they found over 50 articles written by either William Gordon or Ross George. And so I ended up going to Signs of the Times. I actually hired an intern to scan all these, and then I ended up going there. And I knew after this that I had enough information to write a book. But writing a book is just a little bit of it's a little intimidating if you've never written one before, which I hadn't. And so I'd heard that you did drafts, and then you did other drafts, and then you had people look over the drafts, and then you had people edit the drafts, and then you had people make suggestions, and then you had to do all this stuff. And frankly, I was intimidated just backwards and forwards. And a friend made a simple statement to me. He's a colleague and a man who ended up being my editor for this book. His name is Norman Hathaway. He said, just write the book you'd want to read. And that really made it simple for me, because in my time of trying to figure out what show cards were, I had continued to ask the question, hey, where did that name come from? What is a show card? And everybody I asked, sign men who'd spent years as sign artists and show card artists, not one of them really knew where the term actually came from. And so I decided that was my goal, is to tell the story. I needed to start there. So let's take a moment, if you'll go with me just a little bit here, and let's picture in our minds a man of the early 1900s. Our man has short hair. He's got a high part. He's clean shaven. And he's wearing a ready-made suit with a high, stiff arrow collar and maybe a finely knotted colored tie that disappears into a vest. Maybe there's a pocket watch chain dangling from a buttonhole in his vest pocket. The suit's going to be dark gray or dark brown with a matching coat and pants. And if we saw him walking down the street, we might have a problem telling whether he's a businessman or a clerk or a salesman. As we get a little closer, we might notice a pattern of splattered paint around the lower area of his pants, maybe some color-stained fingers, maybe a smudge on his face where an itch got the better of him while he was working. All of these evidence of the tools of a trade that use paints and inks, brushes and pens. The man we see in our mind is a show card writer. His trade was one that was born from sign painting but quickly evolved into its own specialty. And we'll begin with William Gordon. William Gordon's one of my favorites. William Gordon was the mentor sign man to Ross George. And one of the reasons he's my favorite is because in reading 35 or 6 of his articles, I found that he had great humor. Here's an example. Every year along about this time, it appears as regular as the season. I can't describe it intelligently, but the first symptoms begin with an itchy feeling, which makes itself manifest in the feet. Gordon was born on July 31st, 1867 in Woodstock, Ontario, Canada. His father and mother came from Scotland, and it makes sense that they picked this town because it was near the railway and it had work. There was the Woodstock Iron Works. There were companies that manufactured other goods like furniture and candles, soaps, and woolens. And sometime shortly after his son's birth, William Gordon died, and Christina Gordon, his wife, took on the sole responsibility of supporting her small family as a dressmaker. Now we'll go back a few years. In 1851, an event took place that would really form Gordon's life, and that was the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace of Hyde Park, London. It marked what many consider to be the first true World Expo of manufactured products, and it has important implications for our story. Before the mid-19th century, glass was difficult to make. Glass windows were expensive. In Britain and Scotland and France, taxes were levied on the number of windows in a structure, making them the privilege of the wealthy. Commoners' windows were usually simple openings that had no glass. They allowed limited light and ventilation, and they had to be shuttered against the winds and the cold. Early glass windows of that time were essentially made to let in light and were made of smaller round pieces of crown glass that were held together by lead. Crown glass is a form of window glass made by whirling a glass bubble in order to make a flat circular disc. The lump left in the center is formed where the glass blower's rod was cut off. Meanwhile, French glassmakers had figured out how to cast glass with a flat, clear pane. The French window that we know today were showcased for the first time in the Palace of Versailles, built in the 1680s. And the history of show cards, for our purposes, really begins in the late 19th century. One of the most important industrial age innovations for the development of our story was plate glass. As this industry gained momentum, the window taxes were eventually repealed, just in time for the Great Exhibition of 1851. The World's Fair showcased all of the advances in science and industry and technology in one localized venue. The tax repeal, coupled with improvements in production, resulted in the cost of glass being almost cut in half, and London's Crystal Palace contained 300,000 of the largest sheets of plate glass that the world had ever seen. The Crystal Palace sectioned off, or departmentalized, each country's display area. It provided the model that was the genesis of the modern department store. By 1880, Christina Gordon had had enough of the Ontario winters and she decided to move south. Colorado Springs had come to be seen as a resort town. The scenic beauty attracted artists and writers. Its mineral springs and dry climate attracted people seeking health benefits, and young Bill Gordon also had a developing interest in fine art and an aptitude and talent for penmanship. In the mid-19th century, American writing master Platt Rogers Spencer based his system of handwriting on forms inspired by nature. He created a system that took over the teaching of handwriting both commercially and in public schools. Gordon graduated high school showing an aptitude for both art and penmanship. Soon after, he was hired as an instructor of handwriting at the University of Colorado. Ross George was born in Parker, South Dakota on March 11, 1889. Hugh Gordon would have been about 22 at this time. It was an eventful and historic year. President Cleveland had signed a bill to admit the Dakotas and Montana and Washington State to the Union. The Coca-Cola Company was formally incorporated. The Oklahoma land rush officially started, and in West Orange, New Jersey, Thomas Edison showed his first motion picture. In Europe, this was the year that the Eiffel Tower officially opened in Paris. Just a few short months after Ross George was born, the Great Seattle Fire devastated the landscape of that city. His father, Francis, had served in the Civil War. He married Alice Carroll in 1882 and started a family, and though he received a small army pension, he looked for work wherever he could. By 1889, he was working as a contractor and brought his wife, daughter Pearl, and baby Ross to an area that promised work for the foreseeable future. The family of four initially staked out an area and pitched a tent for their home in the remains of the Great Seattle Fire. They eventually moved to a house on 4th and Madison where Ross spent most of his youth. Francis left the family in 1900 and eventually was divorced from Alice. And this is an interesting picture. You can see where he's written where the YMCA is, where I earned my education, but also in the upper left-hand corner in the tree where the leaves are, it says, I lived here. And there's an arrow to a very, very narrow part of a building right there on the very, very left. Ross was now 11, and he had to quit the old central school to work and provide income for his family. He earned income by driving a delivery wagon for a local grocery and selling newspapers for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. His 17-year-old sister Pearl worked as a candy wrapper. The family never saw Francis again. The modern retail shop gradually began to make its appearance. Imported goods were more readily available, there was more variety, and plate glass let in light. It created a more attractive storefront, and it allowed customers to see from the outside into the shop itself. Innocuous things, such as the ready-made suit, had an impact on society. Now workers could dress in a similar fashion as their bosses. Mass production of the razor made it the new era of fashion to be clean-shaven. By the mid-1800s, capitalism and the culture of selling was evidenced in advertisements. Advertisements that were designed more and more to have the wider appeal of middle-class tastes. Shop owners began to realize this glass had great potential for drawing in new customers. They began to make attractive displays. They didn't call them display windows as we do now. They called them show windows. They also realized the need for signage, small display cards to tell the customer what the product was, where it came from, who made it, or how much it costs. Show cards for the show windows. I finally had my definition. And the need for this signage took on a new urgency. This type of sign lettering wasn't designed for permanence. As goods came into the shop, advertising was needed immediately, and as soon as those goods were sold, the advertising was tossed out. The traditional printer wasn't the solution. Window displays only needed one or two of the same sign. The techniques of the traditional sign painter were deliberate. Smaller letters were difficult to make with a brush. As the demand for show cards rose, new techniques for faster card writing had to be developed. The traditional permanence of signs painted on wood boards with oil-based paint designed for exterior use wasn't necessary. show cards were disposable. It was cheaper and faster to make letters on cardboard with water-based colors. This new branch of the signwriter's trade became a specialty. This is a sample of an early show card from the late 1800s, and it's from a Signs of the Times article where the writer of the article has the caption, "An example of how not to do it." This might be one of my favorite ones from the late 1800s because of the variety of socks. Those variety of colors are kind of astonishing. Now, the visual arts developed rapidly in the late 1800s. In the previous 500 years, there had been three major art movements, but in the 19th century alone, there was Neoclassicism, Romanticism, Rococo, the Pre-Raphaelites, Realism, Arts and Crafts, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Symbolism, Art Nouveau, and the Hudson River School in America. The graphic arts developed as well. Previously, printers would use whatever type they happen to have available, and they'd pack in as much copy as possible. The customer would then plaster these handbills wherever they could. Understandably, building owners wanted to take action, and apparently some people didn't think that was fair. Led by visionaries such as Ruskin and Morris, the arts and crafts movement took root. The philosophies of that movement influenced Art Nouveau. Both of these movements would have a significant effect on both fine art and the lettering arts. In the culture of the arts and crafts movement, England's Edward Johnston began his study of ancient manuscripts, and he attempted to bring these traditions and adapt them to the modern world. This would lead to the publication of his Writing, Illuminating, and Lettering in 1906. The poster underwent a remarkable transformation during this age, and lithography was the innovation that revolutionized that medium. Now the poster artist could draw directly onto the stone, and they could use color at will, and they could draw their own letters. Jules Charest is considered the father of the poster, and he began to use three-color stone lithography. The streets of Paris were transformed seemingly overnight with color and image. Alphonse Mucha instantly became known with his posters of Sarah Bernhardt. Art Nouveau would come to be the dominant style for the next 15 years. And this lithography, the ability to have control over the artwork and the text by some historians, is considered the beginning of graphic design. The Americans got in the act too, both with their famous magazine covers that those of us who look back to that time know, and also their posters. Before modern advertising, companies would basically adopt a mascot. This, for example, is the You Need a Biscuit Boy. You can see on the box, it says You Need a Biscuit. Clever. The National Biscuit Company was the one who employed this mascot. We know them today as Nabisco. In 1904, a man named John Kennedy viewed advertising as salesmanship in print, and he created the concept of the reason why approach to advertising. This would create a need in the consumer, and then it would use the advertised product as the solution. Products such as mouthwash and deodorant were invented in the past century, and the advertising industry created needs through these sort of pseudo-scientific conditions like halitosis. And then they provide the solution through the product they advertise, like Listerine. There was also a form of advertising they called atmospheric advertising. This was more for more luxury items, Cadillac cars, Kodak cameras, Steinway pianos. In 1852, a man named Potter Palmer opened a dry goods store on Lake Street in Chicago. 13 years later, he sold it to two young entrepreneurs, one by the name of Marshall Field. The new partners instituted an organizational structure that sectioned off or departmentalized each class of merchandise, reminiscent of that organizational structure of the Crystal Palace. Field instituted innovative ideas such as an in-store restaurant for shoppers. Around 1876, Field hired a young stock boy who worked his way up, becoming manager and eventually a junior partner. His ideas were also new and innovative. Together, they created a shopping emporium where ladies could shop unescorted. It was the talk of the retail world. Only 10 shopping days until Christmas, and the customer is always right, originated in Chicago at Marshall Field's. After 25 years, that young partner decided to take his ideas overseas to London. Harry Selfridge introduced some of the most creative marketing ideas the retail world had ever seen, many of which are the basis of sales techniques in use today. Some of you may have seen the fantastic PBS series with Jeremy Piven on Mr. Selfridge. He was called the Merchant Prince by Signs of the Times. An idea that was new to the London merchant establishment was the window display. Along with the department store, chain stores began to emerge: Woolworths, Five and Dime, and J.C. Penney. Now, the concept here that we want to concentrate on is that the Industrial Revolution produced so many consumer products at such low prices, it caused a merging of the classes. Consumerism actually began to change the retail markets. And with the chain store concept of high volume and low prices, small signs were needed, and the show card market begins to develop rapidly. They'd have to have whole departments of card writers, for example, at these department stores in Chicago. And the department would be a show card writing department, and then they'd have an airbrush department as well. These cards were colorful, they were eye-catching, and the airbrush was in use at this time. And techniques and practices began to emerge that helped card writers produce more effective signs. So layout and design principles began to be written about in these articles in the trade magazines. Layout and design, along with an economy of wording, created attractive sales pieces. And H.C. Martin said in 1930, the show card is an advertisement. It persuades the sales, and it does not merely direct the reader. It should be considered and treated always as a hand-lettered advertisement. Show cards must be real talking salesmen. They were designed to stop the reader. Successful artists wrote articles in the trade magazines about the use and the effectiveness of color. In 1880, when the Gordons first arrived, the population in Colorado Springs was 5,000. In 1890, it was 28,000. Apparently, as a teacher of handwriting, William Gordon grew bored. Penmanship was designed for business, and by nature it had a uniform sameness. But he was an artist, and he saw the sign shops, and he saw colors. And layout and design was a variety. There was varieties in lettering. They intrigued him. And it was one of those times that he found he might have had some itchy feet. Some historians compare the late 19th and early 20th centuries to the Renaissance. Heroes at this time weren't celebrities. They weren't sports figures. The heroes at this time were the inventors. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 was the largest single event ever held in America at that time. 27 million people attended that fair over its 6-month duration. 27 million, when the U.S. population in 1893 was 67 million. Westinghouse's AC power generators, for the first time in such a concentrated fashion, lit the White City. The attendees had never seen anything like it, and it would forever change the way citizens of America and the world will conduct their lives in the 20th century. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, the typewriter, and the pneumatic carpet renovator all made their appearance at this exposition. Department stores where ladies could shop unescorted had revolving doors and escalators, all of them late 19th century innovations. The National Cash Register became a fixture of the modern retailer, and it rang up sales for Coca-Cola, Levi Strauss, and Waterman's fountain pen. People began to take photographs with Eastman's new portable $25 Kodak camera. I'm going to speculate that Gordon was there. I believe this was his first introduction to Chicago. I think he'd already begun the path of learning a trade, and Chicago was a hub for advertising in America. At this time, it was difficult to get information, and here's another one of his quotes. When I first started at this particular line of work, there were no schools in existence that taught it. There was not a trade paper published that contained in a year what is now covered in one issue. There was hardly a member of the profession who would tell his best friend the least little thing pertaining to the trade. And if he did loosen up 10 to 1, it was a bum steer. And the trade was competitive. Secrets were closely held. And in Chicago, you had to be good. To hold his job in a Chicago store, a card writer must be able to turn out interior cards, say a quarter sheet, that's about 10 by 14, by the way, with 2 lines and a price in about 20 seconds flat. Even while working, Ross George continued on with school. He graduated from the Broadway High Night School. At the YMCA, he played basketball, he did a lot of swimming, and he grew into a 6'2" all-around athlete. Seattle is a very interesting city to compare with Chicago. Seattle had a great fire. Chicago created the World's Fair out of swampland. Seattle had the Denny regrade. The Seattle waterfront today largely comes from a lot of the sluiced earth that came from taking down the hills that store owners felt that shoppers didn't want to walk up in order to get to their store. The Seattle waterfront took advantage of all of that earth that was moved through sluices down into and they called it Skid Row. I read a book called Skid Row, and on one side of the sluices was the bad side of town, and on the other side was the good side of town, if I remember my history correctly. Living in an area with that can-do attitude must have been infectious. Ross George rented a small workroom in downtown Seattle, and he opened his own show card shop at the age of 17. He entered a scholarship contest sponsored by the Post-Intelligencer in August 1907, and the paper wrote a short bio about each of the leading scholarship candidates. George's father disappeared many years ago, and the boys had to work to support him and his mother and sister ever since he was a little chap. Ross George was awarded a scholarship and received a letter dated September 24th, 1907, with a check in the amount of $125 and an order on Mr. C. Jack Dryden for $50 worth of instruction in the art of card sign writing for a total award of $175. 2 years later, at the age of 19, the World's Fair came to town. At just about the same age Gordon was, George saw all of the most innovative marvels of his time. By the year 1910, Ross had a little time under his belt, and he'd formed a partnership with William Hill, another young local Seattle card writer who had just a little more experience than he did. By his own account, George still considered himself a novice. He says he had, quote, become proficient enough to write a style or two well enough to make a profit. In addition to writing show cards, Hill and George picked up a new line of business. They began to develop Kodak film. This is one of my favorite pictures, not only because it's showing baseball in its early form, but just on the right, you can see the ball just coming into the picture that she's about to try and hit. George Eastman's portable camera was creating a demand for film developing, and they were determined to take advantage of it. So Ross had something new to learn, and he studied the hows and whys of the process of developing film. Now, I'm going to submit to all the millennials out there who think they invented selfies that this might be the first ever recorded selfie circa approximately 1910. Card writers at this time couldn't just go to an art supply store. They had to make their own pigments. The paint they used was water-based and often prepared from dry pigments as they needed them. The best white came by grinding zinc, or that most toxic of substances, white lead. One of the reasons they mixed paint as they needed it was that they found the binder that worked the best for them was this inexpensive plant-based glue called mucilage. This is an original card done in 1918 with this concoction. Can you imagine writing this delicately with glue? This is 10 by 14, and those letters are pretty decently small, maybe a half-inch high or less. Sign painters' tools were adapted for show card use. Sable brushes, both flat and round, air brushes, and for fine lines, brushes with round ferrules and long hairs called riggers. Now here's one for you. You think you know what a pencil is? Do you remember your mother or grandmother using the term lead pencil? That's because brushes, sign writers' brushes in particular, were called pencils. Brushes were always called pencils up until what we know as the regular pencil was invented. The term comes from a Latin word, pensillus, and means little tail. The rigger's brush name comes from the fact that artists would use them to paint the fine rigging lines when painting ships. Here's an illustration of how they'd use that rigger brush for script writing. They used stub pens and pointed nibs made by companies like Hunt and Esterbrook and Sonecan, drafting tools by Payzant, and a large broad-edged tool they called marking pens and made by the Automatic Pen and Shading Company of Pontiac, Michigan. By 1910, Bill Gordon was living in Los Angeles. The census of that year has him listed as divorced and with the occupation of sign writer. He wrote with a distinctly humorous twinkle in his eye. Gordon absolutely loved the out of doors, and he loved to fish. This article speaks of Big Bear and Little Bear in the mountains outside of LA County in California, and I grew up going to Big Bear. But there is no Little Bear anymore, and with a little research, not easily found, I did find out it was because they built a dam in 1923 and Little Bear became Lake Arrowhead. This is an article from June of 1917 with one of only 4 pictures that I've ever found of William Gordon. Bill Hill and the outgoing Ross George had created contacts in the business community. They networked with the Rotary Club. They were slowly but surely building a nice little business. Their shop came to the attention of another cardman who'd just arrived in the Seattle area. He was a well-known veteran letterer who had traveled around the country working from coast to coast. He'd spent time building businesses in both Los Angeles and Seattle, and he had one of the finest lettering hands in the land, and he loved to fish. George writes about this new partner and the shop he actually ran at the age of 21. Quote, "Back in 1910, when I was breaking into the business, I became associated with one of the most versatile letterers in the West. His name was William Hugh Gordon, and almost every letterer knew of him. He was the creator of many attractive alphabets and contributed his share to the advancement of the art of lettering." There's the second picture that we have of William Gordon, the one in the very back, of course, with his eyes closed. George continues, "I was only a beginner, and I confined my efforts to the kinds of signs I could do rapidly, and this was able to carry my share of the business. I made most of the small cards, jewelry, shoe, and hat, and price tickets, along with the larger sale signs. It was many months before I was able to produce the more elaborate show cards like my associates, Louis Treviso, William Hill, and William Gordon were making. But over the next few years, Ross George would have the opportunity to work hard, pay attention, and learn his craft. One of the influences that created demand in lettering were from the German expressionist styles, heavy Gothic styles of uniform line width. The card writers were looking to improvise in any way they could. They tried all kinds of homemade tools and devices to see if they could reproduce these letters at small sizes quickly in order to be profitable. They were looking for a more flexible pen nib that would make a broader line, would often treat the nibs by heating them so that the metal would flex. Now, most of us associate music pens with the 5-pronged nib in the center there. That nib is also actually a music staff writer. The actual music nib was a pointed nib with 2 splits and 3 tines. It was flexible enough so that it would split wide for the ball shape of the note and then release for the stem. Gordon would often treat these nibs by heating them so the metal would flex even more as he applied pressure. In George's writings, he says the most successful experiments were made by using clipped music pens fitted with a tin or rubber feeders. Mr. Gordon had improvised a sort of chopped off music pen that lent itself to many of the smaller alphabets. Gordon himself later described the pen he modified. I used a Hunt No. 71 music pen with the points blunted on a whetstone and smoothed up on an emery board to remove the wire edge. The more we used this triangle music pen, the more we saw the possibilities of it. We found that we could do twice as much work with it as we could with a brush and get a more uniform effect with less effort. We were pleased to find a way out of the grind and planned our cards to permit as much of the pen work as possible. Moreover, we closely guarded our secret, as we always did any new shortcut or shop trick, for it gave us an edge over unfriendly competition and often brought in many more dollars. The year was 1913. In Los Angeles, 20-year-old Tiny Broadwick became the first woman to parachute from an airplane. And on a warm day, in the middle of June, in their Seattle shop, one of William Hugh Gordon's hand-modified music pens rolled off the desk of Ross George and stuck point first in the floor. The idea for a new type of lettering pen was born. The nib bent. George picked it up and looked at it and dipped it in ink and made a line. Here now was the spark of an idea, he says. Having a bent tip like this could be the key to creating something that would give the letterer a uniform line in a natural writing position. Maybe a faster, more efficient method for commercial lettering, something to truly make the show card man a show card writer. It had been a little over a year of experimentation, trial, and error. Gordon and George, working together, had designed a pen that for the card writer would be a real time cheater. They knew they could sell it. But what sizes, and perhaps more importantly, what shape? How would it be manufactured? How would it be marketed and sold? They asked their friends and colleagues to try it out and give them feedback. They considered the possibilities, and they made their first sale. The goal was to get more letters per dip for the card writers. The reservoir feeder was a concept that hadn't quite been refined yet. Card writers tried all kinds of materials to retain more ink, rubber bands, cellulose, anything they could find. And then the ink had to be addressed. Some inks would flow well through the reservoir, some others would not. They experimented by doping the inks, meaning they thinned them with water or alcohol, or thickening them with gum arabic or mucilage. They'd figure out the right combination only to realize, hey, there's a better way to make the ink feeder, and then they'd have to modify the inks again. Finally, they came up with a design. This is the first Speedball ad. It was run in a trade publication called Merchant's Record and Show Window, and it was published in August of 1914. The interesting part about this is they're talking about crafty new alphabets hand-lettered on half-sheet size by Gordon, the original show card man. And we see that Ross George is quite an entrepreneur because on the right, you'll see George professional brushes and materials that are good to tie to, ready dry colors, liquid mix. And so he was selling anything he could in order to make a buck. At this time, we have to remember that baseball, in just over 40 years of its professional existence, had become a pervasive influence in the American culture. Like any other demographic in America, many card writers were fans of the national pastime. Ross George had spent a few seasons playing right field for the Plymouth YMC team. In 1913, while Gordon and George were working to find the right metal for their pen, Ty Cobb won the batting title with an average of .390. Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics won the World Series. In that same year, hard-throwing Walter Johnson pitched 56 scoreless innings in a row. He won 36 games with an overpowering pitch that today we call a fastball. But in 1913, they called it a speedball. Gordon and George, through popular culture, had found a name for their pen. The speed, they say, with which this pen can be operated either by professional or amateur has suggested a name for itself, a chance remark dropped by one of the first users who happened to be a baseball fan as well as a letterer. It's a whiz, and it certainly is a speedball, and so that's what it is, and that's what it was. The Speedball pen, the little wizard of lettercraft, and the manifold stunts it will perform is attested by all who have tried it and all who have seen its work, of which herewith we present a few specimens from Presenting the Speedball Pen, June of 1915. Initially, the name of the pen is hyphenated. Speedball refers to the name of the pen. There's no ballpoint. It is unlike any tool offered for sale anywhere. Contrived and perfected by Hugh Gordon and Ross F. George, June 15, 1913 to September 1, 1914. They stepped up their advertising efforts. They took out an ad in Merchants and Record in September of 1914, and the first Speedball ad in Signs of the Times was December 1914. Ross George made the first 10,000 nibs by hand. The proceeds from those sales, quote, gave us the money we needed in order to have the pens made in sufficient quantity to supply an ever-increasing national demand. They advertised the two new pens along with two hand-lettered alphabets by Hugh Gordon. The refining continued until 1914. Boy, I'd like to have a couple of those alphabets these days, wouldn't we? This is the send for our new catalog of show card colors and brushes. Ross George, Seattle, Washington. In the year that Babe Ruth pitched his first professional baseball game, Gordon and George began to understand they could make a success of their invention. They'd tried it in the field. They'd proven it in the field. On October 22, 1914, they filed an application for their as yet unnamed lettering pen. Camden, New Jersey, at this time, was a major manufacturer on the center of the East Coast. Their slogan was, "Everything from a pen to a battleship." The Esterbrook Company was there, and so was a fledgling sort of new kid on the block, the Hunt Pen Company. Eva George, Ross George's wife, writes in 1952, so Gordon took the patent and the samples to an Eastern manufacturer and returned with a favorable contract. The partners sat back and waited for delivery, but nothing happened. At the end of 6 months, they began to suspect that the manufacturer had shelved the contract until he could make a pen of his own, as near like theirs as possible, and get it on the market. The plans and samples were retrieved after threats of a lawsuit. I'm pretty sure I know who that Eastern manufacturer was, but it's clear that they took their product then to the C. Howard Hunt Pen Company and found a happy end to their search for a manufacturer. Gordon and George had begun to get letters from card writers who were having trouble using the pen. They didn't understand that it had to be held differently than a traditional broad-edged pen. They realized they needed to create a pamphlet, a little book that would show the possibilities of the pen and how to use it. Presenting the Speedball pen was the first iteration of what would eventually become the Speedball textbook we know today. Welcome to the age of speed. Card writers knew from experience how long lettering would take, and so many of the plates in his first book had alphabet samples that also boasted that it only took 4 minutes and 10 seconds for this 10 by 14 card. The pen, they illustrated in their pages, is for the advertiser, the window trimmer, the lantern slide artist, and every other kind of professional letterer. They garnered testimonials from those same friends on artwork that each submitted for their first publication. The first book was written and illustrated by Gordon. In fact, while George handled the marketing and manufacturing end, he would write and illustrate the first 5 volumes. When they decided to manufacture, they had to choose which pen to produce. They developed both square and round versions of this new bent nib, but they could only afford to produce one. They chose the square style of nib because, as Ross George said, they could market it as 2 pens in one. You could use it on the flat lettering shoe, or flip it over and use it as a broad edge pen for traditional lettering, or create hairlines or serifs, which at that time they called spurs. This plate shows the hand they called spurred Gothic. The modern digital face called copperplate Gothic was derived from this style. Like any new business, Gordon and George had to create a strategy to market their merchandise. The first pamphlet was a success, and it boosted sales of their new line of pens almost immediately. The book and the pens were marketed and sold for $1. By July of 1915, the pen had been endorsed and was being used by high schools on the Pacific Coast. By 1916, William Gordon was one of the most respected show card artists in the nation. He never forgot how hard it was to get a start in the business, and he began to write a series of articles for Signs of the Times, the premier trade magazine of the era. The articles appeared from 1916 to 1920, and developing card writers and seasoned veterans alike began to follow him avidly. The first article was titled Modern Pen Lettering and its Application to 1916 Show Cards. He would adopt this title, Modern Pen Lettering, as the name of his second textbook. In his writing, Gordon taught his readers the fundamentals of letter structure, layout, the principles of design, and designing show cards as advertisements. He wrote with keywords that appealed to everyone, talking about the average show card writer versus the modern letter crafter, and he identified his product with the professional. His presentation is reasoned, compelling, often humorous. Here's a sample. However, we will assume for the sake of argument that some members of this particular fraternity can produce a creditable job on a postage stamp with a shaving brush, while others of us are not so fortunate. At this time, Palmer was a student of the Spencerian method, and he believed that it was an impractical pen method for modern business needs. And so he developed a plain and rapid style that he said adapted to the rush of business. The underlying principles and techniques and exercises used in both Spencerian and Palmer were almost military or drill-like in nature. What set William Gordon apart in his writing was his clear and his practical analysis of the execution of the business of card writing. He came from penmanship, and he advocated the methods, particularly pace and particularly whole arm movement. That is why they call us card writers, he said. I traveled to Cincinnati in April with the express purpose of finding the first ever Speedball ad. This was approximately a year after I had originally seen some of these Signs of the Times in Cincinnati at the American Sign Museum. That first manufacturing run that they had of this pen had problems. This ad was to recall of the product. As I went through page by page, the Signs of the Times magazines from 1907 all the way into the 20s, my perspective changed on what these guys were dealing with at that time. The story within these advertisements is the story of competition. It's almost painful in some of these ads to realize how the competition was trying to cheat them out of their invention. The first pen manufactured as competition came from the Estabrook Company and was placed in Merchant's Record and Show window. And across from it in the same section was the last ad that Gordon and George ever placed in that publication. The competition began to advertise. Pens began to be manufactured with very similar designs. But Gordon and George were smart. Gordon and George patented the reservoir. The reservoir actually was patented to bend with the tip of the pen. And in these other pens, you can see that the reservoir only comes to the tip of the pen but cannot bend with it because of that copyright. In our visit to Speedball, they pulled out production sales cards from their safe, and this was among them. The Estabrook Company was also in Camden, New Jersey. Ross George was dealing with the production issues and he was trying to get them resolved. As they were introducing their round style pens to the market, they also had to deal with the original manufacturer they went to and copyright infringement. Here, we find a strong clue who that first manufacturer might have been. Ask the Esterbrook Company in Camden, New Jersey about the G&G Style B, it says. Now, I just want to take a moment and comment. We're in the midst of the show, and now we're going to have a little bit of a change of pace. We're going to go from telling the story of how these pens were invented to watching the Speedball textbook become sort of a chronicle of lettering over the next 100 years. So take a look. I'll probably be going a little faster and commenting just a little bit less, but I think that you'll find all of this interesting. This is the second Speedball textbook. Modern Pen Lettering is the title. It doesn't have a number on it yet because they didn't know how many textbooks they were going to produce. But some of the pages in this book included this ragged and rugged Roman. Now, this Roman came from the influence of some of the German poster artists who were really prolific at this time, such as Julius Klinger and Ludwig Hohlwein. This, one of my favorite plates in all of Gordon's, it's one of my favorite plates because of the title. This is a unique, condensed, squatty type of letter. And I love the names that he comes up with, but this was a drawn letter. And so you can see as he begins to illustrate these where part of the letters are filled in, and then he's leaving them outlined so that you can see how he's doing these letters. This issue also introduced the round point Speedball. The round shoe Speedball quick letterer is what they called it. And it became immediately popular because it was extremely easy to use. For 2 years now, Gordon had been writing articles for Signs of the Times, and in 1918, he collated these into the most important book to specifically address show card writing up to that time, lettering for commercial purposes. In the trade, they simply called it the Gordon Book. These are some of the pages that came out of the Gordon book and some of the lettering styles that he illustrated. This half script I just think is gorgeous, as well as some of these other lettering styles. In the fourth edition of 1918, that same year, a page advertising the new Style C first appeared. Now, the world was in the midst of the war that created shortages in the available materials. Gordon, for this pen, nicknamed this pen the Rometallic because it would do Roman and italic. When he answered a reader's question, he hinted that production problems would prevent this pen from being introduced on the market until the 20s. But the ad came out in 1918. Now, it's interesting because we all know the Style C pen. We know that the Style C pen is a flat, broad-edged pen, but this pen shows a bend at the bottom of the pen. You can kind of see me holding up a competitor's pen that has that same bend to it. But it was an interesting design feature. The reason that it was designed that way is because one of the problems letterers encountered with movie titling was that when it was projected, the thin thins of a broad-edged pen tended to disappear. But the tip of this pen is turned up just enough, Gordon says, to make the thin lines sufficiently heavy for reproduction. These are some of Gordon's posters that he created with his then wife, that was nicknamed Peaches, and she did the artwork and he did the lettering on these posters. Gordon, in Signs of the Times, wrote the first ever article on screen printing. This is that article, and it was written in 1916. He was working back and forth from Seattle to Los Angeles at this time, and this is an illustration of two posters that were screen printed. You can see that the tree is basically the same in both of the posters, but one of them was done by a movie poster artist, the colored one on the left, and the other one was done by William Gordon. Hugh Gordon died August of 1920 at the age of 53. An excerpt from his obituary reads like this: Mr. Gordon was a genius who had mastered his art from every angle. He truly was a man with a big heart. Everywhere he gave lavishly of the best that he had, and he was constantly lifting up his fellow craftsmen. Through his many contributions, the standard of the profession has been materially elevated. To quote one of his contemporaries, it will be a long time before the world gets another man big enough to fill his boots. This is one, again, of the 4 pictures that we've seen of William Hugh Gordon. Gordon's influence was such that there began a sponsored group of classes that they called the OWL classes. They would have night classes to teach Gordon's methods of learning pen lettering for show cards. Ross George's relationship with his friend and his mentor had ended, but he'd continue to honor Gordon's memory by keeping modern pen lettering updated. Though the copyright mark changed to Ross F. George Seattle in the 5th edition, the title and the cover design that had begun with the 2nd edition of modern pen lettering continued. William Gordon's name would continue to remain on the cover throughout the first 10 editions. And the 6th edition begins to show work and plates from Ross George. Instructional plates like this one that told the reader to hold the Speedball like a pencil. And at this point, George was no beginner anymore. He'd invented the pen, he'd tested it, he'd used it and lettered with it more than anyone else, perhaps with the exception of Hugh Gordon. And we'll see him begin to add alphabets of his own over the next years of modern pen lettering. Ross George was a tall man, about 6'2". He hated traveling from coast to coast, from Seattle to Camden, in rail cars that at the time were made for a man of average height, maybe about 5'8". He had some ideas of how to modify his Ford, and so he took it to the Hunt Pen Company and worked with one of the engineers and modified it. They cut the seats so they would recline all the way, and there was a table that would fold out from the side. They modified the trunk so that it would contain a kitchen, and then he was able to travel across the country in the 20s, before there was a network of paved roads across the country. Here's one of those pictures where you can see the table on the right side of the car. These guys are reclining, and when the top was up, they actually had curtains so they could sleep. He gathered up his wife Ava and made the trip to Camden in a great big adventure. Remember, in the 20s, there was no network of paved roads across the country. There was no gas stations on every corner. It was truly an adventure. And they called this the House on Wheels. The 7th edition shows us a new evolution on the cover. It's the heading preceding the bold titling of modern pen lettering that's changed. It's changed from a comprehensive textbook to the Speedball textbook. In each successive book, we see Ross, now a very accomplished letterer, begin to learn how to teach. He began to incorporate other styles that would attract other letterers besides show card artists. Here's a version of his George text on the left there. Letterers at that time had a penchant for naming lettering styles after themselves. And now we see George breaking down the all-important concepts of layout and design. He's on the way here to creating a system for card writers to follow a general formula to make their cards easier to read, more attractive, and quicker to produce. The 32-year-old Ross George's hand begins to assert itself. Now he was able to begin to present innovative alphabet styles like this edition's Western letters. The Western letters really were influenced by a man named Fred Cooper. In the early 1900s, Cooper was one of the innovators who used a Roman letter form with a blunt serif. and he was famous for the New York Edison ads and his posters for World War I advocating to conserve food and conserve energy so that during the wartime. The 8th edition of modern pen lettering continues. This is one of the most beautiful sketched examples of how a show card should be laid out. Remember, at this time, the show card artists were much more concerned with the layout and design text blocks than they were with perfect lettering. And so you'll see in this card, perfect lettering or fancy decorative stunts aren't as important as the layout and the design. And you'll also see that almost always their lettering blocks are fully justified. Therefore, when you look at some of the spacing in there, they are doing that spacing or they're adjusting their letters with those text blocks in mind. He's introducing now good and bad layout principles. The ideal layout in the lower left was from one of his photo albums that he had cut out and put in there as a sample. And he's working with some beautiful samples. This 20th century classic Roman is a beautiful example, but he's also working with Old English and these letter forms, which are important. The Old English, I'll take a moment to just say that Old English was a printer's term. And since these show card artists were advertisers, they adopted the printer's terms. So Old English, as opposed to what we might look at as Gothic. Gothic to a printer meant lines of uniform width. And so the Gothic letter forms that the show card artists would talk about were lines of uniform width, and one of the reasons that the pen was invented. The 9th edition introduced an oval pen and this letter style called Metropolitan Poster. And the Metropolitan Poster in the 9th edition begins to show that George, this is now the late 20s, is getting less and less concerned with speed and more concerned with the production of strong layout and design and good lettering. And so he's taking more time on his lettering. So this Metropolitan Poster is one of those examples that's not a very simple one-stroke letter that could be done really quickly. And Vanity Roman, the letter form at top and on the left, is also a drawn letter form that is a complex letter form to do. These aren't quick letter forms that you can just pop off really quickly and get out of the card shop. He's also introducing drawings. He calls them Speedball sticks. And here's one of the ads from that time. When better pens can be made, the Hunt Pen Company will make them. These are some original cards of his drawings of what he calls Speedball sticks, these cartoon drawings and pattern drawings that card writers could use in order to add interest to their cards, or cartoon writers could create within their comic strips. Modern pen lettering in 1927 was the first cover printed in color. There's a red overlay to the original design. Some of the most beautiful plates come out of this. This is Ross George now really showing, hey, I know letter forms. And you can see on this original card that he's getting the ink off of his pen on the very edge of the card. He's dipping his pen and then getting the excess ink off before he makes these cards. He's really now analyzing and trying to become a teacher rather than a production letterer. He's teaching people not only how to use his pens, but how the pens are manipulated in order to make the strokes of these Roman letter forms. In the 11th edition of 1929, he created this new dynamic cover design printed in full color. He prioritized the title now. The Speedball textbook is now prominent in modern pen lettering while retaining its place is this time a descriptor. Stunt Roman is actually a pretty famous letter form. It was the genesis of the font, if you want to look it up, called University Roman. many of the sign painters know this lettering style really well. And there is on the left that same layout and design card that Lee Littlewood purchased from the antique dealer. And this card is approximately, it's two large cardboard pieces put together, so approximately 5 feet high, and all of those cards are pasted on them. So there's kind of a seam in the middle that you have to be careful of, but all of these cards are pasted there. And this was Gordon's attempt at creating a block system of layout. He also is beginning to talk about what we talk about as the personality of how each of these letters affect the reader and when they should be used. And so how various letter forms influence advertising is an extremely important part of a textbook to a budding card writer. Now you can also see that he's taking so much more time. There's that same personality script that we saw a little bit earlier with a new iteration, but also look at these block letters that are now really kind of carefully drawn and filled in. These are not block letters that you can do easily with either a broad edge pen or a Speedball pen, but they're much easier to do with, for example, the square style of the Speedball pen. At this time also, color reproductions were now beginning to really come into play in the industry. And so he's taking the cover of the Speedball textbook, he's showing the line drawing, and then he's talking about the color overlays that made the color on the cover of the Speedball textbook and all of those methods. The movie title on the right-hand page is the final time that we'll see any movie titles. These movie titles were a style called derived from and called eccentric title that was used for the silent movies. This is the late 20s, and as most of us know, Al Jolson appeared in 1927, and almost immediately after that, the silent movies went out of business, and talking pictures became the rage. And so we'll have a section tomorrow that will explain those movie titles much more fully. And so the 12th edition in 1935 is probably contains some of the most famous plates of Ross George and this gorgeous cover with the sailboats on it. It's just a beautiful showing all the way around. These plates that George did for not only Showcard Gothic and Showcard Roman and Old English, these were done on larger 10 by 14 cards and then reduced down. But what he had done was he had come in to the black ink of the card with a white dry brush, and in order to show how the brush strokes were made. And so not only are they beautiful, but they're some of the best instruction at this time that anybody had ever seen. These are some original plates that were in the collection that we went through at Sue George Orkowski's home. And this plate on the right with the sort of split script was kind of a more refined plate. There's a small piece that says, "Who's your friend?" down there on the left, and that was done in 1910. And it has some of the glimmerings of an early sort of split script in that thing that George took maybe 20 years later and refined. He's making more elaborate now, divinity italics, more elaborate letters with drawing in them, and the Speedball sticks. You can see the original white on black card of the cartoons that he called Speedball sticks. And now we are totally out of single stroke lettering. We're into drawn lettering. We're into the Art Deco era, and he's working with the Style B Symphony, even sometimes drawing things with a ruling pen and making designs. The 13th edition, this is 1938, shows this gorgeous Gothic carved caps effect, and it's a beautiful piece, and he's got the light in the middle of it. Now, Carl actually talked about this, that in one of the later editions, somebody who didn't really understand what he was doing, putting the light in the middle and then putting the shadows based on how the light was reflecting on each letter in its position, they had rearranged this. And so the shadows didn't make sense because they went to a landscape format instead of a vertical format. And then this one on the right is literally done with compasses and filled in. And you can see very, very small counters in the B and the D, for example. Those are basically the compass points, the O and the Q. Post recaps are a pretty famous Ross George iteration, as well as the line Gothic, which can be seen in some of the type style fonts that we have today. This is a pretty common font to be able to find. And then these bold display fonts are just gorgeous. What he's doing is he's filling in the inked letters, and then he's taking a toothbrush with white paint and splattering them and masking them off. Splatter and spot Roman is one of those pieces. And you can see the lettering just continuing to change as the advertising scripts that we're familiar with. This is 1938, but these advertising scripts look like the 40s and the 50s. And so he was illustrating things that the advertising trends. Now, George was a really accomplished lettering artist, but he was also really accomplished at using correction fluid and white paint in order to make these original plates appear correct for his viewers and the students who are looking at these books. And so you can see, especially on the roundhand script on the right, there's a lot of copy and paste. This was the norm at this time in order to get things done, was the layout and design, copy and paste, and then fix the letters that weren't correct if you needed to. It's also at this time that one of the most important documents that I found told the story of the Speedball pen. This art advisor in 1946 has Ross George telling the story of how that pen had dropped on the floor and how he had picked it up and the idea of the Speedball pen was born. Also, on the left, this is about the same time that we had found some pictures. Now, we're all familiar with, there's a very famous picture of Ross George, but it's from a different angle. And so this picture was from that same photo shoot. I thought it was just a super interesting and beautiful picture and wanted to put that one in instead of the one we're all really familiar with. In fact, the one we're all really familiar with wasn't in the section probably because he had sent it somewhere for publication and never gotten it back. This is the 14th edition now, and he's coming back. There's an original card on the right. That's the Carnival. This is a hand-inked card. It's probably 14 by 18, and he's drawn all these cards. And so, again, you can see now that he's very, very interested not just in one-off hand lettering, but in poster work. So on the left, he's bragging. This is him being proud of his students, that the students of Franklin High School in Seattle, Washington, produced some of these posters. And so he published them in this edition, as well as the Carnival, the original card of which you just saw, and some of the new Speedball rough lettering on the right that looks like it's actually going through, the wind's going through it. Display italics, again, same thing. And we find that as we go through this, that Ross George, at this time in America, was literally teaching America how to letter. This was the only book that had continually been published over all these years, through the war years, both world wars, and they continued to adapt and show some of the new techniques. The Gothic blocks on the right is now showing the cartoon dots that they use. They call them Ben-Day dots. He's showing how to use those in letters, and we'll see those in so many of the cartoons that people are using. 1948 now, the end of the war is over. I loved this picture. This was another picture in one of those same files that we'd found these beautiful pictures. And the interesting part about this, so the small picture on the left is the famous one that I was telling you about, and this looks like almost the same picture, but you can see his arms in a little bit of a different position. Interesting thing about this picture is that he's illustrating a movie poster, and that movie poster is a remake of a glass slide that he had made for a silent movie of the same title in 1922. And so I thought that was a super interesting thing to be able to find him continuing to make movies even when they were on the remakes. He worked closely with the movie industry in making a lot of these cards. He's now talking about sketching with the Speedball pen and the uses of drawing. He's drawing with a small C pen, some of the B pens, and he's illustrating how these things can be built up. By the way, you're seeing these sort of funny slides. These are actually the layout and design that is in the book that will eventually hopefully be published. And so these are some of the layouts where you can see some of the cartoons on the bottom right will go on to the next page, and eventually somebody falls down. He's got quite a sense of humor. And the lettering is becoming more and more not only refined but playful. He's talking about headlines and then this rope style of Speedball. Imagine how long it would take you to sort of draw that out on each pen. He's no longer concerned at all with speed, and yet he also is working with these scripts on the lower right and new possibilities for being able to quickly and casually and have a spontaneous feel in the lettering and advertisements that people might be able to do. This is now 1952. This is the first Speedball textbook that contains interior pages that are in color. And the page on the right is, again, one of those instructive pages for screen printers. And it's showing how the color combinations overlaid with each other can create more color combinations. And so the bottom, he's got his color samples and then what happens when they're overlaid. Now he's producing posters in full color and showing samples. And we get a little bit of an idea of what these show cards look like, all that we've been seeing in black and white all this time. They were very colorful and eye-catching when they did them. This massive power block lettering that he's doing with probably the Speedball A pen is, again, a drawn lettering. And then here are some ways to begin to grid and reproduce smaller pictures into larger posters. And he's adding as well some of the decorated letters and decorated signs. Again, this is the first time anybody had seen these things in color in this particular book. And now 1956, this is the 17th edition, one of my favorite pieces out of that 17th edition, just a beautiful period piece. You can just picture that lady coming right out off the movie screen, can't you? With the outfit that she's wearing up at Camp 5. He's finally refined and defined layout. So at the bottom left, layout, the printer's word for the arrangement of copy. And he's talking about the ways to lay those out. Now, again, in a new way to explain something to somebody 40 years after he began trying to articulate these things. And then the progressions of how to make posters, what the structure of posters should be, and what the progression of the posters could be. He's working with some of these beautiful lettering styles again. We're now in the 50s, and so you're seeing some gorgeous styles. I love this tri-line Gothic on the right. And then in 1959, this is the obituary. He died in 1959, and this is the Signs of the Times obituary talking about inventor of the Speedball pen, longtime sign man, and he died February 19th of arterial sclerosis at the age of 69. From here, the next Speedball textbook then was published by the Hunt Pen Company. They continued the tradition that he had begun, and they drafted Charles Stoner and Henry Frankenfeld in order to begin to work on these and come back with the new book. You'll see on the right, this is the first book that introduces the steel brush. And the steel brush was introduced, and I believe perhaps that the steel brush could have had its genesis way back here when we were taking a look at these sort of pounded together off the workshop pens. I'm not really sure how well these pens could have worked with all those layers and how big they were. I think they probably would have made about half a stroke. But if you look at a steel brush, it's made of layers, and it's got some foam inside of it that helps convey the ink. And so he was going to be touting this in this edition as a great new breakthrough for poster work. We first see now the Chancery cursive. Donald Bolognese, I actually called him and interviewed him. He's still alive, living on the East Coast. And he did this. He was an instructor at a college. He was an instructor of lettering at a college. And then we also have Ray DeBall's Celtic calligraphy illustration on the right as we come into the New Age. And then there's, again, Donald Bolognese and some of these from Ross George. But the lettering on the bottom in color is by Donald Bolognese. And then the Speedball textbook continued to evolve. So in 1965, the 19th edition, and then in 1972, the Hunt Manufacturing Company did the final one with Frankenfeld and Stoner. And in 1985, the 21st edition, they were going to manufacture it, and they'd hired a company, but the company really didn't know much about calligraphy. And one of the Speedball people, one of the Hunt people, happened to go to a calligraphy show. And there was a lady there who was talking about her calligraphy, and she had a very outgoing personality. And they asked her if they would consult on this calligraphy book, and her name was Joanne Fink. And so very quickly, in the middle of this production, Joanne was like, oh my gosh, no, these guys have no idea. And so she immediately called Sheila Waters, Alice, Pat Buddes, Mara Cooper, Ward Dunham, Donald Jackson, and she corrected any of the errors she saw, and she ended up making the deadline, but she added some of the calligraphers that we know today. And then she teamed up with Judy Caston in 1991 to create the 22nd edition of the textbook. And the textbook really became a book of calligraphy and calligraphers. And so 1999, with this gorgeous cover by Mike Kessig, they featured all of the calligraphers. Now, Angie and I, in the 24th edition, were tasked with illustrating sort of the 100th anniversary edition, and we wanted to go back and reach all the way back and talk about the history of the Speedball pen and how these things evolved. And I'm super proud of how we did that. It was a privilege to be able to work on it. And it was also a privilege to be able to kind of track what was happening this year. And Carl Roars and Suzanne Cunningham and Sachin Shah have created this spectacular book that is probably some of the best layout and design and some beautiful calligraphy. There's a lot of new and exciting artists that are in this book. And Carl was so kind in his introduction. He basically said, the 24th edition talked so much about the history, it freed us up to talk about the contemporary calligraphers. And so this is the book that if you don't already have it, oh, please, I highly recommend that you would get it. And it's just a beautiful book, and I can't say enough good things about it. But it's been, we're now to the end of our show, and I just want to leave you with a couple of designs. When I was at Sue George's house, Sue Yorkowski's house, and we were going through these, she was a little bit confused, and she said, I don't know what to do with all this stuff, and I want to donate it, but I'm not really sure what to keep. And so I had showed her, I would keep a few pens, and I would keep a few things, but this piece is drawn letter forms, and then these are tracing paper overlays that were hand colored by Ross George. And I just thought it was so beautiful, and I told her, well, if it was me, I would keep this piece. And so I know that this piece resides at her house along with some pens and a couple of other pieces that were important to her, some beautiful artwork that was in his files that maybe one of the artists did and never it got returned to the artist. Lucky her. But it's been a pleasure to go along this journey and work with not only the people that I was able to call, do the research that taught me so much about how these letters came about and how these pens came about. I'll leave you with this. This is the book cover that was designed by Norman Hathaway. He's the man that I've been working with, a longtime graphic designer. He's in museums, and I've been just so fortunate to be able to work with him. And he told me he wanted to use this as a book cover, and he sent me a rough. And he asked me, hey, what do you think about this? And I was kind of standing at my computer, and I said, I either absolutely hate it, or I think it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen as a book cover. And he basically said, yeah, I just wanted to put what you normally write on the back of a book on the front of a book. And by the way, I want you to hand letter it. And so we did a bunch of lettering trials, and this ended up coming out with the D nib, that oval nib. And this is the nib that we went to create this, and then he put all of this together. And so I really think it sort of says everything that needs to be said about the story of teaching America how to letter, the Speedball story. So I just want to thank you for being so patient as I've gone through this slideshow. And I'm going to now turn this back over to Trish, and thank you for your patience, and I hope you enjoyed the show.